Thank you for joining us today for APH's Access Academy webinar called Collaborative Psychoeducational Assessment of Students with Vision Impairments. We are so happy to bring this valuable content to you today, which has actually been in the planning for some months now. Our presenters bring so much to our table of learning that you will soon see. Dr. Terese Pawletko has worked with children since 1976. She was first a teacher of the visually impaired, and then as a school and pediatric psychologist. Since 2001, she's been in the private practice evaluating children with autism spectrum disorders, vision impairments, and other learning and developmental challenges. She has consulted nationally and internationally and presented workshops on autism and children with visual impairments. And it is a joy to have her with us today. We also have Dr. Carol Evans with us, and she began teaching students with visual impairments in 1971 when the primary access tool were flare pens and darkening dittos. I haven't even thought of the word dittos for a little while, so I loved having that tidbit. Seeing a need, though, for accurate identification of additional, particularly learning disabilities in her students, she re-specialized in school psychology to develop ways of providing access to items on individually administered tests of intelligence and academic achievement. She is here with us today and fully committed to passing on her wisdom and experience to a next generation of teachers. We are so grateful. So today, this is what you can expect. We hope that you will walk away with having heard and know about the role of teachers of the visually impaired and how it relates to psychoeducational assessments. We want to discuss issues and caveats associated with psychoeducational assessments. And lastly, we hope to identify contributions that the TVI makes within the context of a psychoeducational assessment. There is so much to do, so many things to learn about and talk about. I am ready to pass things over to you, ladies.
All right. Well, we're thrilled to be able to do this. We're going to be talking about the collaborative psychoeducational assessment of children with visual impairments. Uh-oh. It's not advancing. Hang on.
It's advancing. It's just a little slow.
Thank you. All right. Panic is gone. So Carol and I have both been fortunate to work with a number of the kind of grandparents and have been mentored by a number of folks in the field. These are several references. Collaborative Assessment Pathways to Literacy was a blog that was recently done from the Perkins School for the Blind. It's worth looking up. Marnay Lofton, who is a really well-known and very well-respected psychologist from the Texas School for the Blind website, or from the Texas School for the Blind, and who also authored Making Evaluations Meaningful, a book that's also under revision, has written that blog. Collaborative assessment, working with students who are blind and visually impaired and those with additional disabilities, was written by Steve Goodman and Stuart Wittenstein. And then our quote grandparents are Joan Chase and Dr. John Morse. Both of them have done a tremendous amount of work in the area of evaluating children with vision impairments, and were really influential for Carol and myself. Another respected author is Sharon Bradley Johnson, who wrote Psychoeducational Assessment of Students Who Are Visually Impaired or Blind. And just as an FYI, the California School for the Blind is giving a 3-hour workshop. This seems to be the topic of the week, but they're doing a 3-hour workshop on evaluations of children with vision impairments on Wednesday. That will be available on a YouTube channel within a few weeks, as they are, not everybody can make a 3-hour commitment. So thank you. As Amy already identified, we're going to be talking about the role of the teacher, the visually impaired. We're going to discuss the caveats and issues, and also talk about the contributions that a TVI can make within the context of these evaluations. And while the focus of the talk is really on cognitive or intellectual assessment, the principles that we're going to be discussing really apply to all psychoeducational evaluations, including academics, speech and language evaluations, and those conducted by the occupational therapists. Now, when we have a child with a vision impairment, we have to think about what needs to happen in advance of that evaluation, who the key players are that are going to be involved in that evaluation, and what the considerations are that need to be taken into account. Carol?
Yes, well, when a child is referred, what needs to happen? Typically, we need an evaluation planning meeting so that we're clear on the purpose of the evaluation. What are the referral questions? What questions do we have about this child's learning that need to be answered through this process? And we need to make sure the key team members are present, including the parents, especially because especially with these kids, they need to feel like they are heard and that the team understands what's different about this child than it would be for a sighted child. The teacher of the visually impaired needs to be there, the classroom teacher, the special ed teacher if one is involved, and the school psychologist. Reasons why children with visual impairments are referred for evaluation. A lot of these are the same as would be for any other student. Establish a baseline at the time of medical diagnosis of vision impairment or the referral to special education. And services from the vision program are special education. They cannot be provided by a 504 plan because it's not just access you're providing. You are providing skills so that they can make use of that access. And we want to identify patterns of strengths and weaknesses in cognitive processes and academic skills. The general doctrine for years has been that barring any additional disabilities, the student with a vision impairment should be able to make progress in the curriculum at about the same rate as sighted students. And we need to find out if there are additional disabilities like a learning disability, and we'll talk about that in some detail later. Communication disorders, orthopedic disability, intellectual disability, and autism spectrum disorder is a big one, and Terese is doing a presentation on that soon. And anything else that might be present that would impair the child's ability to progress in the general curriculum. And we want to be able to design remedial and compensatory strategies to help the child do well in general curriculum. Now, and also we want to provide documentation for needed classroom accommodations. And here you see a photograph of a student playing a musical instrument and using enlarged music that's being displayed on a video magnification system. Now, when I had students taking orchestra or band, I had to enlarge their music on 11 by 17 paper and spread it across 2 music stands. And here this girl is going to be able to fit in with everybody else in the band and use just 1 music stand.
So who are the key players when we're evaluating children with vision impairments? And these evaluation meetings may include all of the following, depending on the reason for the referral. So the child, of course, is the focus of our evaluations. The parent, who has a wealth of information and knowledge, and including the developmental history of their child, as well as kind of current medical status, because some of these children have issues that, their eye conditions are going to be degenerative. So it's important to know those, or the etiology may have a really complicated presentation. the teacher of the visually impaired, which we're going to again talk about in some detail, an orientation and mobility specialist. And for those of you that are not familiar with what an orientation and mobility specialist does, they often are working on things like body concept with children, orientation to the environment, and travel skills that are beyond just cane travel. It may include using, public transportation and various other techniques and strategies. A speech and language pathologist may be involved, an occupational and or physical therapist, and of course the school psychologist. Now, the school psychologist brings a wealth of expertise and also knowledge with them. We're trained to understand the strengths and limitations of various assessment instruments and methodologies. We understand child development, and we're trained to integrate the information from and findings from all available sources and the evaluations conducted. So we can serve a really integrative role, and we're collecting a lot of information from multiple sources. The teachers of the visually impaired should be included in the evaluation planning meetings. Now, there are a couple of things I know that because teachers of the visually impaired are a rare commodity in some areas, they're often under contracts. And so districts may or may not be willing to pay for the teacher of the visually impaired to participate. However, it's really critical that they be included in the evaluation planning meeting. They may need to be able to order some of the adapted test instruments, such as the Woodcock-Johnson Braille or large print edition. Now, I'm just going to take a moment. In Maine, I live in Maine, I asked the lending library to order both a large print and a Braille copy of the Woodcock-Johnson so that any evaluator in Maine would have access to that and when evaluating a child with a vision impairment. But it takes a week or so to get that shipped through the Free Matter for the Blind to the locale where it's going to be used. So it requires some advanced planning. The teacher of the visually impaired can provide team members with invaluable information. They can review materials about and the implications of the particular eye condition. So for instance, if you have a child with retinopathy of prematurity, there may be detached retinas, which often leads to total blindness, or retinitis pigmentosa, which is a degenerative eye condition that gradually restricts the visual field to pretty small degree of view. Oftentimes we think when we're doing evaluations, we're going to enlarge materials, but with a child with retinitis pigmentosa with a restricted field, enlarging it may exclude a lot of visual information beyond their field of view. So those kinds of things are pretty important to know about. The developmental history and early intervention. Oftentimes, teachers of the visually impaired have been working with the children from the time they were born. And so you have, all that longitudinal data or information that the teacher of the visually impaired can be providing to the school psychologist, speech and language pathologist, OT or PT, or other team members. And they can also share from the functional vision assessment, which for those of you that are not in the field of blindness, it's really what the functional vision assessment is. It's a collection of observations in terms of how the child uses their vision across a variety of tasks and environments. And the learning media assessment is an evaluation that is conducted by teachers of the visually impaired to look at what the primary medium for educational access is going to be. Is it going to be tactile? Is it going to be auditory? Is it going to be print? And that's determined through a learning media assessment. And those have implications in terms of how the child's going to learn and access the curriculum. But it's invaluable information that can be provided by a TVI to the evaluation team members. They can help with reviewing the appropriateness of the testing material in advance of the administration, which is huge in terms of how helpful it can be. Demonstrating the use of low vision devices and technology regularly used by the child as it applies to those testing methods. And there's, as you'll see later in the talk, the range of appliances and adaptive aids that are available at this point that can be used during assessments. They may be able to conduct vision simulations for examiners. Oftentimes, the teacher, the visually impaired, may have access to these goggles that replicate or simulate different eye conditions, which again can give you a sense of what visual demands are being placed on the child with a vision impairment during evaluations. And then they can collaborate within the actual testing setting. And they can provide, support in terms of taking notes, in terms of the child's visual function during testing. They can help with behavior management. They can help in terms of, looking at the child. If we're doing a Woodcock-Johnson Braille adaptation, unless you're familiar with the Braille code, it can be hard to know what the child's writing, what the child's reading, and how accurate it is. Even as a rusty TVI, I really benefit from the support of a teacher, the visually impaired. The TVI can provide clinical information about the particular vision impairment that the child is experiencing. So that includes the etiology, what's the underlying cause of the vision condition. They can review visual acuity, both near and distance. They can talk about field restrictions, which is that narrow field of view or that tunnel vision that goes along with retinitis pigmentosa. They can review lighting needs that the child has. And lighting is incredibly important because depending on the visual impairment, you may want more light or less light. So a child that has photophobia or that's associated with something called a chromatopsia, which is a color blindness beyond the traditional color blindness. It includes a lot of retinal sensitivity. You want to use lower levels of light with the child who's photophobic, or directed light as opposed to more diffuse light. Contrast sensitivity. So what's the degree of contrast that the child's needed? As Carol mentioned, it used to be just, Sharpie pens and darker lined paper and things. But now we're looking at test materials that may have a variety of contrast on the page, and we really need to be able to look at the child's sensitivity in terms of how it relates to the test materials that we're using. They can review prognosis. So like I mentioned, for the child with retinitis pigmentosa, that's a progressive or degenerative eye condition. And there are other eye conditions that are progressive and many that are stable. And then what the medical treatment has been to date. So did a child have a repair to their dropped retina, or are they getting glaucoma drops? And then what recommended treatment there is for the future, if any. So before the child is seen by an examiner, what should be happening? Well, it's important that we sit down with the TVI to review the test materials and see whether they're accessible. And if not, how we're going to adapt them to make them accessible, or how to present that stimuli in terms of lighting requirements, in terms of enlargement, in terms of increasing contrast if that's possible, etc. And then consider inviting the TVI into the testing session. As I mentioned, they can be invaluable in terms of recording observations that they're making, as well as we're making as we're trying to juggle materials, as well as assisting with behavior management if that's required, because they know the kids really well at the point that they're involved. All right. Carol. Oh, well, let's stop and see if anybody has any questions. This may be a good place to do that. Are there any questions, Amy?
There have been a few questions that have come through. Specifically, what I want to ask about is, do you by chance have any suggestions or things on the top of your head about suggestions that would be given to a speech and language pathologist? I know that there's some general things that could be said, but just thought I would pass that out as an initial question.
Carol, jump on it.
I'll be glad to address that. One of the tests that has been published that would be completely non-discriminatory would be the word test. And if you need more than that, and we don't have time for me to describe that, but if you need something that goes into other realms of speech and language, you just need to make sure that the visual stimuli make sense to VI kids. And I did see a question pop up in the chat about school psychologists not letting anyone look at the materials ahead of time. That should not exclude the teacher, the visually impaired. So if you're working with a school psychologist who won't show you the visual materials, ask to be given someone else to work with, because you are a professional. You're not going to be redisclosing these materials to parents or anyone else. So you should be treated like a professional and shown those materials.
Right. And it's not like we're going to be, as teachers of the visually impaired, we're going to be coaching the children. I mean,
No.
that's pretty clear. It's pretty much to support the school psychologists and other examiners that are administering the measures, not to disclose or coach.
Right.
So.
Thank you. There was only one other that would fit in well with this, to plant maybe as a seed here in the beginning. In thinking about the things that you're going to be presenting specific about visual impairment, is there anything that you would want to speak on or say generally about evaluating students with cortical visual impairment?
We are not. Oh,
Go ahead, Carol. Go ahead, Carol.
Well, we're not specifically addressing that because that is an area of so much specialized need, but it is out there. There are many children who have both cortical and ocular problems, but that should be a whole additional
workshop by itself.
Very well. And I want to mention too, because you mentioned that, this is a great segue to our audience. There is an additional handout that has some specific information about visual impairments, different diagnoses. This is more of an information.
Yeah, I'm sorry, with links to current information about those eye disorders.
Absolutely. And so this is something that, especially for you folks that are with us that might not know as much about visual impairment and just want to have a better understanding, that is available and accessible. I think we're up to date and we can continue moving on, ladies.
Great. Thank you. Go take it, Carol.
Okay, what are the implications of the current population of visual impairment? Way back in the early 70s, when I started teaching, most of the children that we served were what were then called vanilla blind. And some people find that an offensive term, but that really meant visually impaired or blind, but without additional learning challenges. For one thing, they weren't saving as many micro preemie babies then as they are now. And they didn't have a lifespan in those days, but technology and medicine has advanced to the point where we have many more children who were premature, who have prematurity related vision problems, as well as neurological problems that can result from a stroke, sometimes happening pre-birth or sometimes happening in the immediate neonatal period. And then if you have a neurologically based vision impairment, those children are at risk for additional difficulties because the brain is where it's at, folks. Let's face it, we hope for neurological intactness, but we don't always get it. And then the issue of stable versus deteriorating conditions. Now, given that no intellectual assessments currently on the market have been developed specifically for children with vision impairments, can intellectual assessments provide teams with meaningful information? And I was a member of a task force years ago that answered that question. IQ tests can provide meaningful information to individuals who are blind and visually impaired, as well as to their instructors, families, and decision makers, provided that all tests be administered with key points that reflect the uniqueness of the population, as well as appropriate cautions. And we will be discussing a few of those points from the position paper during this talk. So, what to administer? 2 cognitive measures if possible, especially if the first test is in the intellectual disability range. Verbal and memory components all major tests of visual function of cognitive function include both verbal and memory components, and they also include visual, perceptual, and spatial. So we need to have some cautions in regard to these things. You're always going to be able to deal with the verbal content and the memory components of any major intellectual test. For visual, perceptual, and spatial, we will do those, but we have to watch for visual fatigue. It requires visual attention, and sometimes that causes some fatigue, and we may need to stop and switch to another activity to give the eyes a rest. And sometimes we can just say, okay, you can relax and turn off looking. And then we have a lot of cautions regarding the reporting of the results of the visual spatial components. So we're going to base this on the Wechsler scales, which are likely the most frequently used tests of intelligence in use in the United States and other English-speaking countries. And the Wechsler scales include 5 separate scales: verbal reasoning, visual spatial abilities, fluid reasoning, working memory, which includes both verbal and visual, and processing speed. And that's all visual, so that we have a lot of cautions for that. Verbal reasoning can be impacted by visual experiences having a direct impact on their vocabulary development. Visual memory, ability to identify something that's described as particular to the RIAS-2, the Reynolds Intellectual Assessment Scales, that has a subtest called Guess What, where objects are described and the testee needs to identify what that object is. And cultural and experiential differences. Let's say on vocabulary, what is a clock? What is a window? And if we had time, I'd tell you a great story from Sheila Amato. Many of you know her, about how she tried to teach a totally blind student what a window is by jumping out the window and handing him things that she found on the ground. Comprehension. What should you do if you find an iPad on a bench in the park? Why do soldiers wear uniforms? And to illustrate how concept development can be impacted by blindness, we have this cartoon. The examiner is asking the blind young lady, what should you do if you see a burglar climbing into the window of your neighbor's house? And she says, I would fall to my knees in gratitude for the miraculous restoration of my sight. Allow time for laughter. And
Mommy says not to bother her when she's playing bridge. Yet another thing in terms of idioms and how somebody might interpret what's being said visually and tangibly. So anyway.
And multiple meanings for vocabulary words.
Multiple meanings, and also the experiences that are different. Oftentimes people hear about the blind man and the elephant, where what one person's experience of elephant is the trunk, while another one's is the bristly tail, and another one's is the foot. So depending on what your frame of reference is, it can be providing really different experiences and really different ideas of what that concept or what that object is. So anyway, I have to thank Carol for these great cartoons. So in terms of visual spatial reasoning, the subtest selection on that component of any cognitive measure really depends on the child's level of visual acuity and function. So if they're in the mild to moderate range in terms of visual functioning and visual acuity, that means you can use large print or magnification. you may be able to use some of those subtests. But if it's in the significant to profound range, you're going to have to look at Braille or tactile representation of objects and concepts. And the implications for reporting scores on a visual spatial task, it's qualitative interpretation only. And we're going to harp on that to the nth degree, because we've both seen horror stories where somebody has reported full scale IQ, visual spatial reasoning, fluid reasoning, and so on and so forth. Yet it can be considered discriminatory against children and individuals with visual impairments, and we'll talk about why. Fluid reasoning, again, depends on the level of low vision that's available. Oh, let me just go back to this. The other issues in terms of visual spatial is they're timed tests. And it's going to be, it takes a child with a vision impairment longer to use their vision. And the other thing is that they're slower to process visual information. And then there, on top of that, there are the distortions that are due to the visual impairment and visual processing. And another layer would be the field restrictions that may make it really difficult for the children to scan effectively in terms of block designs or other things that they're having to shift their visual gaze from one point to another. So those things are really important to take into account when we're working with kids with vision impairments and using visual spatial kinds of tasks. Fluid reasoning, again, depends on the level of low vision that's available. And again, we have to consider the time constraints on the Wechsler scales. You have matrix reasoning. So it's useful information in terms of, can the children identify the underlying rule that's defining that particular matrix, on that particular page. There are, and then figure weights is, does the child have quantitative reasoning? And there are timed presentations, so they can only look at it for certain periods of time. And so we have to keep that in mind in terms of how it's impacting the child, because they are going to be slower to process that information, and yet it's useful from a functional perspective. Do they understand the concepts? They're expected to function in a sighted world. And so we have to look at how they're going to relate to the sighted world in terms of their understanding of particular concepts. It's important information that may be yielded in those subtests. But again, qualitative interpretation only, not reporting scores. Now, I know that the Q Interactive is going to generate scores. What you have to do is just shelve them because it's not appropriate to report them in a report. So procedurally, the results from the visual subtest must not be computed into a visual spatial fluid reasoning processing speed index or a full scale IQ. And I know for developmental, for adult services, they're requiring full scale IQs. I have written a letter to the disability councils to make sure that the adults are getting services and justifying why they're not going to get a full scale IQ. And so we're going to interpret the visually influenced subtests purely qualitatively and functionally. Working memory, we're administering most often the auditory components of it. We can consider the visual memory depending on the level of low vision, but keep in mind that the visual memory items are timed and are going to impact the scores for a child with a vision impairment. You have to think about, you have 5 seconds to view something. Even on a RAML, I think it can be, up to 10 seconds. And it's not enough to adequately scan a field, of stimuli for a child with a vision impairment. So it's really important to keep that in mind. And yet it may be useful information. If you give them 10 seconds, does that give you some, give them more viewing? It's breaking standardization, but if they are able to look at it in 10 seconds and they can perform the task, that gives you useful information in terms of what their visual memory in the face of a visual impairment may be. Processing speed, again, depends on the level of low vision. You can enlarge the pages on the coding form and on the symbol search form. Again, it's breaking standardization and they're time tests. And so you may look at it strictly for, does a child have the visual discrimination abilities that are required on the symbol search? And are they able to transfer information from one location to the other in an effective and fluid way? Again, we're going to, as we mentioned earlier, looking at visual fatigue, scanning accuracy, and so on and so forth from a functional perspective. But that's being determined in conjunction with the teacher of the visually impaired. So accommodations to items and methods of presentation. This is one of the issues that's discussed in the position paper that Carol was a co-author on. And the guideline 6 talks about adaptations, which include accommodations that do not change the concepts tested, nor the level of difficulty of those particular items. That's really critical. When the Woodcock-Johnson was developed, the adaptation was developed, it was developed based on a panel of experts that reviewed each item for whether they were appropriate to include in the adapted version of the Woodcock-Johnson. Now, the Woodcock-Johnson had a Form B, so they were able to pull from both Form A and Form B to develop that particular measure. But it was really critical that those items were not going to be discriminatory against the child with a vision impairment or an individual with a vision impairment. Any adaptation should be planned in advance in collaboration with the visual impairment or the TVI or the rehab professional and the test developer. And any adaptations need to be well documented in a final report. So the visual spatial items or subtests that are administered, if the individual is using vision for learning, then consider administering some of those things. And that the functional vision assessment, which are those samples of observations across a variety of tasks, and the learning media assessment, which is looking at the primary medium that the child is using for educational purposes, whether those support the presence of adequate vision for specific items, then you can think about administering them. And that both the TVI and the examiner have agreed that the results are going to provide meaningful information and support the referral question. We don't want to be doing this just kind of willy-nilly, that there really needs to be good rationale for administering those particular items. And that they're including things such as extended time, the uses of video magnifiers or a larger tablet for digital administration. iPad Pro is something that when you're using Q Interactive, if you have access to one, it gives you a larger viewing screen. But there are also other tablets that, as you saw with Carol's demonstration of the musical scale, that the video magnifiers can be fairly large and fairly good in terms of adaptation. So before I turn it over to Carol, I wanted to check in with Amy. Any new questions pop up, Amy?
This goes along with, you were talking about extended times. One of our questions from the audience is about students that might need to be allowed more time to visually scan things. Yep. So that goes in with including that extended time. So is there anything else to be added to that, or is that pretty much it?
I think it's pretty much making sure. I mean, you're going to be looking at the size of the material that the kids are scanning. So is it an adequate size and adequate contrast in addition to the extended time? And if we're extending time, then again, we go back to not reporting scores because we're breaking standardization, because the tests are giving a finite amount of time that's allowed for viewing, for visual memory, and for other things. Okay. So it's basically, we're ditching the scores in service of, does the child have the concept if they're allowed the time that they need to scan it.
Okay. And then I'm going to read this question just straight as what it was written in the chat window. Sure. I understand why you would not want to report the index scores for the VSI and FRI. When describing scores qualitatively, could you describe scores in the descriptive ranges such as low average or average range, etc.?
Go ahead, Carol.
Okay. I sometimes would report, let's say a student had an average or better result on a visual subtest. I would say as well as or better than the average student who is cited. Does that make sense? The person who asked that?
I think my only caution is if in fact this is, well, a couple of things. One is, are we giving them extended time? Then you're breaking standardization, so you can't report the scores from that perspective. But I would also be cautious in terms of reporting even the ranges if in fact the child's vision is such that it's not adequate to, you know, accurately discriminate or process that information. So I'm still really cautious in terms of the reporting, even in terms of ranges, because it's still, and we're going to get into caveat statements in terms of how we go about reflecting that. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that, Carol.
Well, I would use that mostly when the student had really good skills for that particular thing.
Right. I guess that's what I'm thinking.
Yeah. And I wouldn't necessarily, but in also describing how the child performed on something that was too difficult, you could explain it in terms that his vision is not adequate to this type of task,
right?
Whether it's timed or untimed,
right?
That he doesn't. When you get to the qualitative interpretation examples that are in this slide presentation that we may not have time to get to, then you will see examples of how those things are covered when a child's vision simply isn't adequate to do that type of task.
Okay, there's one final question. There's others that have popped up, but
Okay.
I'm going to speak this one question, let you continue, and then I need to get caught up because there's a lot of things that are populating. So the last one for this little segment, do you recommend any Oh, you know what? That was not. Okay, here's the one. My apologies, audience. In administering and interpreting a cognitive assessment, is it appropriate or acceptable to only administer and report the verbal components / verbal IQ? Go for it.
On the Wechsler scales, you can check the box when you're electronically scoring for the verbal extended. And that is that would be a composite score that would consist of all the tests that can be given verbally that are not even included in the core, like comprehension and all the verbal memory. And that is the only composite that would be valuable.
Right.
But that's the thing to use if you're testing a child who is totally blind or who has such low vision that visual tasks are not meaningful.
Right. Yeah, I basically grab every verbal and memory related tasks that I can in terms of the cognitive measures that are meaningful and accessible. So whether they are part of an index score or not, because it's, like you said, it's invaluable information and it deepens our understanding. So great.
Thank you. We can continue.
Okay, let me move ahead. Carol, I think this is yours.
Okay, now we need to thoroughly look at whether an adjustment that you will be making is an accommodation or a modification. An accommodation doesn't affect the basic concept or the level of difficulty, like you're providing the stimuli in Braille or in large print. Modifications affect the basic concept or level of difficulty, like the use of a calculator.
Sorry.
Go back. We can't allow that on the tests we give because we're really looking at, can the child provide this response without the use of a calculator, like the mathematics tests on the academic assessments. But either change increases the need for caution in interpretation of results. And there may be a few situations, like with a low functioning student, that you might want to allow them to use the calculator to show that they can solve that problem using that tool. But you would not for anyone that you expect to be able to, that you should expect to be able to perform that calculation. And we can go to the next slide. And then we have tactile and symbolic representations. Symbols, tactile graphics, and miniature objects must be carefully considered and used with caution to represent pictorial or graphical information. Real objects should be used whenever feasible. I was on the team that prepared the first edition of the Woodcock-Johnson in Braille, and we developed a kit that examiners could assemble, a large bear and a small bear, and any other question that used a picture. We had a kit of toys, basically, that could be used to represent the concepts where the picture was necessary to be able to perform the operation of the question. So that's where real objects. And here's an example of a miniature. Lots of kids, blind and sighted, play with miniature cars. You want to know whether your blind child understands that miniature and the real object it represents. So you know, yes, this is a car, and they'll play and run it on along the surface that you're using. But can they, in a parking lot, identify a car? Do they know what the parts of the car are and what they're used for? And the visual stimuli must be carefully analyzed to determine the relevance to the concept being assessed. And can it be made accessible, like with the toys that we mentioned? Any changes or eliminations? Now, when the Woodcock-Johnson was created, there were items on Form A that weren't appropriate, so they went to Form B to pull items that may be more appropriate, and they have a wonderful scale, the W scale, that allows you to make sure that the items are equivalent in difficulty when you're pulling items from a second form. And any changes or eliminations of items need to be accounted for. And again, real object and miniature object. Go ahead. Now, here's one from an old test, the Stanford Binet 4th edition, which was my go-to evaluation for kids with low vision, because the one thing that was block design didn't have bonus points for rapid completion. It was called pattern analysis, and it just had a time limit, and that time limit was generous enough that I had a student who got an extremely high score, and even within the time limits. And he had 25% of a visual field in one eye, and he was able to do that brilliantly. And he said, oh yeah, I do puzzles all the time at home. That was his favorite hobby. So what's wrong? That test had a visual absurdities subtest. What's wrong with this picture? And if anyone wants to answer that, what's wrong with this picture?
Could you visually describe for those
Yes.
individuals that might not be able to see the image?
This is a blurry picture of a man sawing a log. It's a large log, and it's held up by two sawhorses. And he's sawing into this log of wood, but there's something wrong with it, which my low vision student could not see. What's wrong with it? Can we just go back to that slide for a moment? You can't see, the way this picture is, that the thing that's wrong with it is that the saw blade is inserted upside down, and the teeth on the saw are not in the wood. Now, when I demonstrated this item to a class at the university once, there was a man in the class who could tell me what was wrong with it because of the position of the handle. But that was an unusual thing. But when I put this same picture on a video magnifier, go ahead, he was able to see. And on that subtest, as soon as the kids started laughing, you knew that they got the absurdity. And this is an old version video magnifier. And now we have, due to electronic miniaturization, we have newer versions, and this is one of many new portable versions that are available. And if you have, like they do on academic assessments, a picture of a clock and the child needs to read that clock and tell you what time it is, there are various tactile representations of clocks available. And if the child knows how to tell time on an analog clock, they should be able to do this. Go ahead. Now here, let's say on a test of letter word identification, and the very earliest one is going to have one letter on it and pictures. So what we did was we substituted basic shapes for the pictures and put in the capital A in Braille.
So what's on the left-hand side of the
Yes.
picture one says a saw, a letter A, a pencil, and a cup. And on the right-hand side adapted, there's a triangle, a Braille letter A, a circle, and a square.
Yes. Thank you, Terese.
Yeah.
And here is a letter word identification. And on the left are print words, another large different animal, play, learn, world again. And on the right side, these are represented in uncontracted Braille, which is fully spelled out Braille without reduction of space using contractions. And
this is a place where the TVI would be really important to include in terms of the assessment, because the Woodcock-Johnson Braille adaptation has both contracted and uncontracted Braille, and you need to be able to know which pages you're going to be using with the student that you're evaluating.
Exactly.
Hence
Has the child started to learn contractions yet?
Yeah. So just
And
wanted to
with
point that out.
the previous slide, were the shapes on that right side, were they tactile? Were they raised?
Thermoform. Yep. Yep.
Great. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you, Amy.
And then here is the same list of words with print on the left side and contracted Braille on the right side. And Braille contractions serve the purpose of reducing the amount of space that's needed.
So as an example, another is ANOTHER.
Right. And the next one is LARGE.
So just as an example.
Just as an example. Actually, you know, it's amazing how much space Braille books take up. Like an ordinary algebra book in Braille volumes could be 20 volumes long and take up a whole space in a classroom. And we actually had a dictionary on our shelf called the American Vest Pocket Dictionary, which took up a shelf and a half in our office.
Wow.
Oh, and I see a comment from someone, every single page of print equals 3 pages in Braille. That sounds like a fair estimate. And here's another tactile representation example. What we have here is an item in an academic test that shows a picture of a pencil next to a ruler. And about how long is this pencil is the question. So we adapted that question by sharpening a pencil to be that long, in this case, 7 inches, and putting it next to a Braille reader. And the student who had the skill of measuring with a Braille ruler would be able to respond to that question accurately. And here's another question. And over the years, this arithmetic question has changed context. Originally, it was if each of these children ate an ice cream cone, how many would be left over? Well, over the years, it's changed to chipmunks and
Acorns or something.
and acorns. But this, and I simply changed the wording to represent these small white ones, Legos, as candy bars, because I didn't have any tactile ice cream cones.
So there are 3 little people and 5 Lego blocks.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
Yep.
And is this where you take over, or am I still?
Nope, you're on for another couple.
Okay. So particularly cautions in assessment would be inadequate consideration of the implications of the vision impairment on the assessment process and the interpretation of results. And at one end of the continuum, we can make one wrong decision and attribute all learning and behavior problems to the vision loss and ignoring other needs like an additional disability. And at the other end of the continuum, attribution of nothing to the vision loss, underestimating cognitive ability, inappropriate classification, and inappropriate placement. And I can give you an example of that in my intern class. There was someone who had tested a child who had very low vision and reported a full scale IQ for this young child. Because there was not a discrepancy between the visual and the verbal components of the test, which is something every school psychologist or diag knows, that if there's a big discrepancy, you don't report the full scale.
Good afternoon,
Oh,
boys
no.
and girls. Listen carefully. Third grade walkers dismissed.
Hang on, I need to switch. Can you tell I'm in a school?
Oh,
No worries. We all understand that.
Well, it's going to be going on forever.
so,
I need
and at
to-
the other end of the continuum is attributing nothing to the vision loss, underestimating cognitive ability. And okay, I was giving you an example of this. Sorry for repeating myself. And that was, she reported the full scale IQ and the child was placed in a self-contained classroom for students with intellectual disabilities, which back in those days was called mental retardation. And I questioned her use of the full scale IQ. She said, well, there wasn't a discrepancy. And I said, but you have no way of knowing how much higher his scores on the visual components would be if he weren't visually impaired. He may have a severe speech and language impairment, which makes you think he's ID. But you have to interpret the visual results in light of the visual impairment and what he's able to do visually. And the erroneous belief that co-occurring diagnoses are excluded by virtue of the regulation.
If you're ready to speak, Terese, you can unmute yourself.
Oh, Terese, you need to unmute.
All right, I got it. All right. I didn't know where, there was no unmute button that showed up. So I'm working. The buses are going to be announced for like another 5 minutes. So hopefully I tried to turn it down. I didn't even factor that in. One of the things that has been a source of frustration for Carol and I over the years is the notion of the learning disability description. Because the way the federal regulations have been written is a specific learning disability does not include learning problems that are primarily the result of vision, hearing, or motor disabilities, of mental retardation or emotional disturbance, environmental, cultural, or economic disadvantage. What ended up happening many times is because it couldn't be the result of a vision impairment, kids with vision impairments were excluded from the learning disability grouping, even though they clearly had a learning disability. So it does not say that a learning disability cannot coexist. It's particularly with the population of children with vision impairments that we're dealing with now. Many of the children that have neurologically based visual impairments are at increased risk for learning disabilities. And we just need to keep that one in mind. And so when people are reading the regulations or going over the LD forms in the IEP and evaluation team meetings, please, please, please keep that in mind. All right.
And we have a link to a really good article by Marnie Lofton. And I suggest everybody read that.
Yeah, that's great. Another caution is that the inappropriate administration of the full battery and reporting of full scale composite or other total scores can lead to underestimates of cognitive ability for the reasons that we've talked about, that the children may be discriminated against because of the time factors in many of the subtests. So it's really important to not report those particular scores. Carol.
We have to understand that the verbal IQ alone paints an incomplete picture of students who use their vision for learning. And when I started to get into the field, that was what was done at the School for the Blind and pretty much everywhere else. I was hearing that you just give the verbal because the visual parts aren't meaningful. But if they're using their vision for learning, we need some of that visual part to see how well they're using their vision. And why use visual impairments? And this was during the time I was transitioning from being a TVI to being a school psychologist. I attended a workshop at the California School for the Blind that was days long. And they covered, may I be excused, my brain is full. It was one of those moments. And when Richard Russo, I was at a roundtable discussion over lunch with Richard Russo, one of the school psychologists at the California School for the Blind. And I said, why do you use the visual items? And he said this, and it was so profound that I have remembered it for well over 20 years. Yes, 25 years probably. And he said, to document the extent to which performance declines when excessive demands are made on a faulty visual system. Just sit with that for a moment. And that applies to both kids with ocular visual impairments and neurological.
Absolutely.
Etiologies.
Amy, I wanted to check in and see where we are with questions before we continue.
There is one intriguing kind of statement conversation I'll put out there. So I'll make the statement, the situation, and then we'll kind of tease it out from that point. So knowing that we have mentioned teachers of the visually impaired to be at the table for planning,
right?
To be able to have access to materials in order to help make that determination,
right? And
knowing that just because something is placed in a tactile format does not mean that it's equal.
Right.
So that's the preface.
Right.
So if a student uses Braille and tactile diagrams because there's no functional vision, when is it useful to administer these visual aspects of the evaluation? So sometimes things might be placed in a tactile format, thinking that it's equal because you can touch it.
Right.
Did you want to expand on any of that or just share a flavor of your opinion?
Carol, you want to start?
Yes, I think that what you have to do is make sure, and this is where the school psychologist comes in, because a school psychologist or educational diag should be able to determine whether the task demand is equivalent. Let's say in the arithmetic question, if 3 of these chipmunks each eat 1 acorn, how many will be left over? That is an equivalent task demand, and that makes it appropriate. And that was when I was working with Lynn Jaffe on the first Braille version of the Woodcock-Johnson. We were addressing every single item as to whether the task demand would be equivalent.
I think, Amy, the question that you also have is, are you talking about transferring the actual picture and doing a thermoform version of the picture, or not necessarily to that degree?
I think that there is enough room for our interpretation of how we wanted to take the question. I read it as it had come through, and just even wanting to plant those seeds for people, and especially those who are not familiar, that you are new to the field of visual impairment, at least knowing that just because something is made in the tactile
form,
media form, thank you, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's equal. And that teacher of students with visual impairments can also help weigh in, especially on that student and what that student's ability is.
Right. I think the other thing is just even in terms of concept development and tactile information. I mean, you go through a whole graphic learning curve in terms of how do you read graphics, which is another layer on top of the evaluation component. So I know that tactile graphics kids need to learn how to process and how to organize that information. So you have the Braille code, but then you've got also the graphic representation issues. So
that is a great reminder. And actually the attendee kindly put in that what she was referring to was for a non-visual student, do you just skip the visual parts of the test?
Yes, I do for the most part, unless there's some already available adaptation. There's at least with the older kids, there are some versions, and Joan Chase, who is the grandmother, developed an actual measure, but it's on a really restricted range of children. She didn't have a big sample, so that its applicability can be limited in terms of the scores and so on and so forth. But Carol, you're chomping at the bit.
No, I wanted to say about that. It's her concepts were based on what was available visually on the WISC-3, and it cannot be used to combine with the verbal for a full scale IQ. And at this point should be interpretative qualitatively.
Right.
Okay.
So, all right. So now that, anything else, Amy, before we go on?
You are perfect to continue.
Okay, thanks. So testing is done. Now what do we do? So the psychologist and the TVI would sit down to review the results and really discuss those in light of the vision impairment and the child's life experiences. And within that report, writing up the accommodations and any of the modifications that were employed for that evaluation. I also like to include the functional vision descriptors. Was the child exhibiting fatigue? What were their problem-solving approaches? Did they recognize when they were making errors? And so on and so forth. It's just really useful information. Did they persist? And then we're going to include caveat statements. Carol?
Well, if the results of the evaluation do not express themselves in the IEP in some meaningful way, it's a waste of money, brains, and time, otherwise known as a wombat. The outcome of the evaluations should support children with blindness and visual impairment in the mainstream. Are they swimming along with everybody else? Are they floating, or are they drowning?
The evaluation should not be the sole determinant in terms of cognitive abilities. You want to look at how the child's performing beyond the actual testing. The presence of additional disabilities, so we're going to include other measures beyond the cognitive measure, particularly if we're suspecting intellectual disability. You have to include an adaptive measure, and it's useful for children with blindness and visual impairments in general to include an adaptive measure, because we really need to look at how those children are functioning in all areas of life. There's something called the teachers, those in the vision field know about this, but there's called the expanded core curriculum. And for those who are not involved in education of blind and visually impaired children, the expanded core curriculum includes things like technology and supports for a curriculum, but it also includes things like activities of daily living and travel skills and technology and other compensatory things. But we really need to look holistically, because children with vision impairments do not pick up things or learn incidentally, and they need to be provided with more elaborate and more expansive services as a result of their significant vision impairment and its impact on their quality of life and their learning. And then we've got eligibility for special programs. Caveat statements, this is one that I include in every one of my evaluations. There are no measures developed for children with vision impairments. Therefore, this child's performance is being compared to the cited population on whom this measure was developed. The results should be considered conservative estimates of the child's cognitive abilities, given their life experiences have been different from birth than those in the normative group. And that's just, something that I routinely am including because I want people to keep in mind that I'm comparing them to a sighted population of children, and that since birth, their experiences, and even though they may have some usable vision, it's not processed the same way. It's not experienced the same way. It's even when you have a child that just needs corrective glasses and I have a sister who might as well have been legally blind because they didn't discover that she needed glasses until she was a second grader. But she functioned as somebody with low vision for years and kept tripping over things. And she didn't know she wasn't seeing, improperly or incorrectly until she got her glasses. So we need to keep those kinds of things in mind. Another caveat is the precise determination of the cognitive ability level of individuals with visual impairment is particularly challenging. It is necessary to interpret findings in this report with cautions for two reasons. The instruments were standardized on the sighted population and certain adaptive procedures were required to administer. And so listing those kinds of things, this was one of Carol's. We have many, many, many examples of caveat statements and descriptions within the handouts, so feel free to peruse those. So we can go through maybe, Carol, why don't you read one other one? We got some time.
Well, we could do this one.
Sure.
Although Laura's performance on the WISC-5 symbol search and coding subtest was accurate, she worked slowly and very carefully on these subtests of processing speed. Laura has nystagmus, and this is where you have to collaborate for interpretation with the TVI. She has nystagmus, rapid involuntary movement of the eyes, and photophobia, extreme response to light associated with albinism. And these typically cause her to need more time for detailed visual work, which then can run into a recommendation for classroom accommodations.
Right.
And that would apply to a paper pencil rather than a digital measure of processing speed. So
here's just another example. Olivia was unable to respond accurately to items on the WISC-5 picture concept subtest when wearing her glasses. She was able to see the details of the pictures when items were presented on the video magnifier. She stated she finds it easier to read fluently when using this machine. So again, you have implications in terms of education and accommodations that she was using.
Right.
and that she was able to do the evaluation measure as a result of that use of video magnification.
One of the things about the video magnification, I just want to put out there that popped in my mind. So I hope it's okay that I'm making this conversational.
Absolutely.
So one of the things that we should also be mindful about when using a video magnifier, that sometimes students need it in order to reduce the amount of visual clutter, in order to be able to concentrate on and focus on something specific. So I just wanted to put that out there, especially for our friends that are part of the audience that might be new to just the nuances of visual impairment and blindness, that sometimes that video magnification is needed, not necessarily for clarity, but could be just for that reducing the visual complexity, the clutter.
Right. Great point. Any other questions, Amy, while you're there?
Well, sure. One of the things is, and please forgive me if we talked about this and it was mentioned and it went past me, the age at which we explore doing psychoeducational assessments. And the reason being is that there was a question that was put into the chat window having to do with when a younger child might be just best to use the Oregon Project data.
Right.
So that Oregon Project, if I'm not mistaken, it's typically birth through maybe age 5 at the most.
I think it goes up to 6.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. So I just wanted to mention, could we talk about age range for a moment?
Sure. Carol, do you want to chime in first, or?
Well, on the Wechsler scales, you have, are you asking at what age do we do this kind of testing?
Sure, like maybe we could talk about some of the younger students, and then if we have a student that's young and something is being requested and we know that it's not the best match for the student,
Right.
making those alternative decisions of what's best to use for collecting data on very young children, or
Right.
should we say developmentally young?
Yeah.
We can.
Yeah. Go ahead, Carol.
No, you go ahead, Terese.
I was going to say, in terms of the really young children, I tend to go with the Oregon project because it's been developed on children with vision impairments, and you're getting information across all, domains in terms of development. So you've got the social, you have the communication. And for those of you that are not in the vision field, the Oregon project is a criterion reference. It would be similar to a Brigance, only more detailed and it goes by, it clusters things by, 1 to 2 years of age, 2 to 3 years of age, and so on and so forth, up to age 6. And it has a cognitive component, a fine motor, a gross motor, a communication, a social, and there may be a self-help, I think, those are the main dimensions of it. So it really gives good information and age ranges. It's not going to yield a score per se, but it's really helpful in terms of looking at whether the child has a skill, yes or no. And are they showing some delays relative to other kids with vision impairments? So I think of that as being a pretty useful measure for really young, and particularly for kids with developmental delays. But Carol,
I agree.
Yeah.
And if you are operating at a point where some decisions need to be made, one of the member of the audience, Vicky Namkana, said about the Oregon project, it's a checklist and it's not normed, but it
Right.
gives a great deal of useful information, and it helps you generate goals.
Right. It's strictly a criterion reference thing, right?
I wanted to just jump in for a moment. We lost a little bit of audio from you, Carol, for a moment, and you were reading from the chat window that an attendee had written in about a checklist and not normed. However, it gives much information, and that was just to the audience in reference, if I'm not mistaken, to the Oregon project.
Right.
Oh,
Thanks,
okay.
Yeah.
All right. If you are in a situation where a child is in 1st or 2nd grade and you need to find out whether this child has an additional disability, you are going to have to use a norm reference test.
Right.
And so the ones we suggest, like I can just give you off the top of my head a suggestion that the Stanford Binet 4 was terrific. I am not a fan of the Stanford Binet 5, particularly for our population, because there are too many confounds within the materials, too much visual on the verbal and too much verbal on the visual. And so my go-to would for school children of any age would be the Wechsler scales. And then if you have kids who cannot, you probably, for fatigue and other reasons, will probably have to break up that testing, especially if you're doing visual portions, into more than one session.
I've also used the differential ability scale.
Oh, okay.
With some of the kids with vision impairments for some of the younger kids. So it's got a range of components to it. So it's got visuals. It has all those standard kind of components: verbal, visual, spatial, nonverbal, and so on and so forth. So I've used that. And I've even used it with children with CVI, where I was able to kind of slide and slowly present, stimuli by occluding other things and basically functioning as their frontal lobes, because they couldn't shift visual fields really easily or scan from item to item. So I had to support them doing that. But I was able to do that with that particular test. So other questions, Amy? And then we'll, let's see.
You're great to go.
Okay. So additional disabilities, Carol and I just thought we would give some more information in terms of what's prevalent. So intellectual disabilities often prevalent in children with retinopathy of prematurity. No surprise because of the low birth weight and the risks that are involved with the prematurity. Cerebral visual impairment or cortical visual impairment, and etiologies with specific neurological involvement. And then autism and vision impairment is a particular subspecialty of mine. And these are eye conditions where there have been documented cases in the research of autism spectrum disorder. So retinopathy of prematurity, optic nerve hypoplasia, anophthalmia or microphthalmia, Norrie syndrome, Leber's congenital amaurosis, rubella syndrome, Peters anomaly, Charge syndrome, Alpert's syndrome, and albinism. And having said that, there are also the whole range of function of typical, anywhere from average cognitive ability or higher with some of the kids with albinism. So you have some children with spectrum disorders and other children that can be high functioning or with learning disabilities. So learning disabilities in children with albinism, aniridia, CVI, Stargardt's disease, and retinopathy of prematurity.
Although we have had genius children in those categories.
Absolutely. So I guess just know that there's some of all in each of the groups. What a concept, the normal curve. This is the position paper that Carol collaborated on, and that is worth reading, and it's available on the American Printing House website. Additional resources, the Psychoeducational Assessment of Children Who Are Blind and Visually Impaired by Sharon Bradley Johnson. Marnay Lofton's book, soon to be out, we hope. Don't buy the current version, Making Evaluation Meaningful. It's a phenomenal volume, well thought out and well written, and Collaborative Assessment, which is by Goodman and Wittenstein.
And it was the first book to come out on this concept. And even if you can get a used copy, even though it refers to tests that are no longer in use, the concepts and principles in that book are
invaluable.
Yeah, it's still worth having, even though it's out of date.
And also look up the printed Perkins School for the Blind blog that Marnay Lofton wrote on collaborative assessment, because it is a gem. It is an absolute gem. And this is Carol's and my contact information. So feel free to give us a shout if you need any support or have any questions. But this has been a real pleasure.
It has been a great learning opportunity. I know that Leanne and I tried our best to keep up with everything in the chat window. I'm sure there are a few things that may have been overlooked, not intentionally, but these are great resources. And to our audience, please do go to our APH handout list on our webpage to be able to extract this accessible handout that has all the contact information, as well as some of the links, as well as an additional handout that gives some general information about specific visual impairments and specific considerations that you would need to think about before doing an assessment.